All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to start the broadcast now. Mark, give it a 15 count and then go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, known as SNAPS. My name is Mark Allison, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is ESG Program Components and Activities. We are lucky to have these national experts presenting today. Michael Rowenhouse is the Director of the Program Coordination and Analysis Division within the SNAPS office. He directs the Emergency Shelter Program, helps manage the HPRP program, and oversees policy on the homeless elements of the Consolidated Plan, HMIS, and the point-in-time and housing inventory counts. Brett Guino, also with SNAPS, has been instrumental in providing assistance in the development of the regulations in support of the HEART Act. Janet Pershing is a project manager at ICF International. She provides technical assistance on a number of HUD programs, including ESG. Irene Piwan is a program manager at the Corporation for Supportive Housing, a national HUD TA provider. We also have two expert resource advisors with us today. Susan Ziff is the HUD team lead for ESG and HPRP, and Fred Berman, who is a senior associate with the National Center on Family Homelessness. Before we get started with the presentation, I would like to make a few logistical announcements. Today's webinar will last 1 hour. The webinar is being recorded. Both the recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be posted on the HUD Homelessness Resource Exchange website next week at the address on your screen. About an hour after the end of the webcast, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey. We encourage you to complete this, as your comments and suggestions are very helpful to us. If you experience any technical difficulties seeing or hearing the webcast, first try logging out and then back in, and that usually takes care of it. We do recommend using your telephone and not your computer for the audio for better sound quality. Also, you can request technical assistance at any time during the webcast by using the questions box. While all of your questions are very important to us, the presenters will not have time to address them individually during the webcast. Our two resource advisors, however, are standing by and will attempt to respond to your questions in real time. To ask a question, just use the questions function on the toolbar. If you have any questions that we aren't able to get to, you can submit them to HUD's virtual help desk at the web address on your screen. Our objectives for this presentation today are for you to be able to describe all eligible activities and costs for ESG, describe the key requirements for program components, and to locate tools and instructions on the HRE to assist you in your preparation for implementation and operation of ESG programs. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mike Rowenhouse, who may or may not sing today, to start the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. Depends on if we have technical difficulties. Good afternoon, everybody. Recipients and subrecipients may use funds awarded to them to carry out activities related to 5 components and related administrative costs. ESG consists of these 5 components, and they are street outreach, which provides essential services needed to reach out to the unsheltered homeless people and get them connected to shelter and needed services. The emergency shelter component provides essential services to people in emergency shelter and supports renovation and operations of these shelters. The homeless prevention component provides services to keep people from becoming homeless and having to live in an emergency shelter or on the street. The rapid rehousing component provides service to help people who are literally homeless move quickly into permanent housing and achieve housing stability. The Homeless Management Information System component pays for the cost of operating and contributing to the COC's HMIS. Administration is not one of the 5 components. but 7.5% of ESG funds can be used for administrative activities. The majority of this webinar will walk you through a detailed look at the activities that can be undertaken under each component and all the eligible costs under ESG that support program delivery. Next slide. As alluded to in the previous slide, ESG funding is allocated and awarded by HUD to states, urban counties, metropolitan cities, and territories, collectively known as recipients. In turn, recipients may award all or a part of those funds to subrecipients, that is, jurisdictions located within the boundaries of the recipient jurisdiction and/or nonprofits serving residents of the recipient jurisdiction or some portion of that jurisdiction. The majority of subrecipients can carry out all the activities within the components. As you can see, we laid out the grid of these different component activities and who is an eligible subrecipient, with the exception as to states. States may not subgrant to themselves or retain funds except in 2 instances. For administrative costs, but they must share with units of general purpose local government those administrative costs if they make a direct award to a local government. And HMIS costs where they are also the HMIS lead. Now I will turn you over to Brett, who will walk you through the first program component.
Thank you, Mike. We will begin with the first of the 5 components, which is street outreach. Next slide, please. The street outreach component is designed to serve unsheltered individuals and families, meaning those who qualify under paragraph 1 of the definition of homeless. In determining whether an otherwise reimbursable activity counts as street outreach, the key consideration is where the service is being provided. Services provided to unsheltered persons on the street, parks, or in other locations where unsheltered persons may be staying are properly described as street outreach. If an unsheltered individual seeks services in a day shelter or overnight shelter, then the essential service is appropriately categorized as emergency shelter. As Mike will explain later, the services eligible under emergency shelter are much more expansive. Next slide, please. Eligible street outreach costs are divided into 6 categories, which you can see on the screen. The following slides will detail the eligible activities under each category as established in the interim rule. The important thing to understand here is if it's not on the list and it's not in the regulations, it is not eligible. Next slide, please. We won't spend a lot of time on these next 2 slides. They're really provided for you as a resource and to provide a high-level overview. But I encourage you to use this presentation as a future resource and to compare it with the regulations. The first eligible activity under street outreach is engagement. It includes the activities to locate, identify, and build relationships with unsheltered homeless people for the purpose of providing immediate support, intervention, and connections with homeless assistance programs and other mainstream social services and housing programs. Next slide, please. The second eligible activity under street outreach is case management, and it includes the costs that are detailed on this slide. Next slide, please. The third eligible activity is emergency health services, and it includes what is on the slide. The important word here is emergency. There's a much broader range of services eligible under emergency shelter. These are really the services that are meant to address emergency needs. ESG funds may only be used for these services to the extent that other appropriate health services are inaccessible or unavailable within the geographic area. Next slide, please. The fourth eligible activity is emergency mental health services. These include services provided by licensed medical professionals operating in community-based settings like the streets, parks, and other places where unsheltered homeless people may be staying. ESG funds may only be used for these services to the extent that other appropriate mental health services are inaccessible or unavailable within the area. And again, like emergency health services, the key word here is emergency. Next slide, please. The next eligible cost is transportation, and this includes travel by outreach workers, social workers, medical professionals, or other service providers during the provision of eligible street outreach services. It also includes transporting unsheltered people to other places where they may receive services. Next slide, please. The final eligible activity under street outreach is services to special populations. Essentially, this includes all of the previous eligible activities, but allows recipients and subrecipients to target those services to specific subpopulations, including homeless youth and victims of domestic violence, who are also homeless and living on the street. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, who's going to talk to you about emergency shelter and the much broader array of services that are eligible there.
Thank you, Brett. The ESG regulation defines emergency shelter as a facility with the primary purpose of providing temporary shelter for the homeless in general or for specific populations of the homeless, and I think this is important to remember, which does not require occupants to sign leases or occupancy agreements. Facilities meeting this definition may use funds to carry out activities under these components. Additionally, projects that no longer meet the definition of emergency shelter that I just cited, but were funded as emergency shelters in fiscal year 2010, may continue to receive funding for these activities through the ESG program with future grant year funds. So there is a permanent grandfather for those agencies that were funded in 2010 under that emergency shelter definition at that time. Next slide, please. In determining whether an otherwise reimbursable activity counts as emergency shelter, the key consideration is where the service is being provided. Services that are provided in a facility or to renovate or operate a facility being used as an emergency shelter are considered emergency shelter. Emergency shelter could include overnight accommodations as well as shelters that provide essential services and a place to stay during daytime hours. Next slide, please. Eligible costs are divided into 4 categories: essential services, renovation, shelter operations, and assistance required under the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, URA. The following slides detail the eligible activities under each category as established in the interim regulations. Next slide. Essential services. The first component of eligible activities under emergency shelter component is essential services. And essential services includes 11 distinct services that can be provided to individuals and families who are in an emergency shelter, including tailored services for special populations. The following slides will review more details. Next slide, please. The first eligible activity under essential services is case management. Case management includes the cost of assessing, arranging, coordinating, and monitoring the delivery of individualized services to meet the needs of the program participant in an emergency shelter, including such things as counseling, information and referrals, service planning, and the coordination of benefits. Next slide. The second eligible activity is child care. This includes the cost of child care for program participants, including providing meals and snacks, and comprehensive and coordinated sets of appropriate developmental activities. Only licensed child care is an allowable cost. Eligible children must be under the age of 13 unless they are disabled, and then they must be under the age of 18. Next slide. The third eligible activity is education. Education services are eligible when they are necessary for the program participant to obtain and maintain housing. Eligible costs include a range of activities that contribute to improving knowledge and basic educational skills, such as books and supplies and tutoring. Next slide. The fourth activity is employment assistance and job training. Certain costs of employment assistance and job training programs are eligible. The slide provides a detailed list of eligible activities, including such things as classroom, online, and/or computer instruction, on-the-job instruction, and services that assist individuals in securing employment, acquiring learning skills, and/or increasing earning potential. Next slide. Fifth activity is outpatient health services. Licensed medical professionals may provide direct outpatient treatment of medical conditions as detailed on the slide. Note that eligible costs are only for licensed medical professionals and that ESG funds may only be used for these services to the extent that other appropriate health services are unavailable within the community. Next slide. The sixth activity is legal services, and eligible costs include legal advice and representation by attorneys that is necessary regarding matters that interfere with the program participants' ability to obtain and retain housing. Next slide. Such matters may include child support, guardianship, paternity, emancipation and legal separation, orders of protection and other civil remedies for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, appeal of veterans and public benefit claims, and the resolution of outstanding criminal warrants. Legal services for immigration and citizenship matters and issues relating to mortgages are not eligible costs. Next slide. The seventh eligible activity under essential services is life skills training, and the activities include teaching critical life management skills that may never have been learned or have been lost during the course of physical or mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, and homelessness, but are necessary to function independently in the community, including managing money, budgeting, and conflict resolution. Next slide. The eighth activity is mental health services. Licensed professionals may provide direct outpatient treatment of mental health conditions as detailed in this slide. Mental health services are the application of therapeutic processes to personal, family, situational, or occupational problems in order to bring about positive resolution of the problem or improve individual or family functioning or circumstances. Note that services must be provided by a licensed professional, and ESG funds may only be used for these services to the extent that other appropriate health services are again unavailable or inaccessible within the community. Next slide. The ninth activity involves substance abuse treatment services. These services should be designed to prevent, reduce, eliminate, or deter relapse of substance abuse or addictive behaviors. ESG funds may only be used for services to the extent that other appropriate substance abuse treatment services are unavailable or inaccessible within the community. Inpatient detoxification and other inpatient drug or alcohol treatment are not eligible costs. Next slide. The 10th activity is transportation. Eligible costs center around a program participants travel to and from eligible essential service activities and may include the transportation costs of staff to assist in these activities. Purchasing or leasing a vehicle is an eligible cost under the emergency shelter essential services category. Next slide. The 11th activity is services for special populations. This category of essential service activity is reserved for the delivery of any otherwise eligible essential services to the following special populations: homeless youth, victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and services for people living with HIV/AIDS. Next slide. The second category of eligible activities under emergency shelter component is renovation. The interim rule includes 4 types of improvements to an emergency shelter under the renovation category. They are renovation, major rehabilitation, conversion, and other types of renovations. Eligible costs to perform these renovations include labor, materials, tools, and soft costs. Remember, property acquisition and new construction are ineligible costs under the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. All buildings must be owned by a government entity or a private nonprofit organization and are subject to minimum periods of use described next. Next slide. The interim rule establishes that renovated buildings have a minimum period of use following rehab renovation. This period is not less than 3 years or 10 years, depending on the type of renovation and the value of the building. The rehab use requirements are really the same as those that we've had in the past. And to summarize, the 10-year minimum use requirement applies to major rehab where the costs exceed 75% of the value of the building before rehab. The 10% use requirement applies to the conversion of a building where the costs of rehab exceed the 75% of the value after rehab. Finally, the 3-year use requirement applies to rehab costs that are 75% or less than the value of the building, once again, before rehab. Next slide. Shelter operation is the third category of eligible activities. Shelter operations include eligible costs to operate and maintain emergency shelters. A full list can be found on the slide. This category also includes costs for providing hotel or motel vouchers when no appropriate emergency shelter is available for a homeless family or individual. Next slide. The fourth category of eligible activities is assistance required under the Uniform Relocation Act. These policies are relevant when a person is displaced by a project assisted with ESG funds. In some instances, the cost of providing URA assistance are eligible costs under this category of the emergency shelter component. It is important to note that a person receiving URA assistance is not considered a program participant under ESG, and relocation payments are not considered rental assistance or housing relocation or stabilization services under ESG. This is a cross-cutting HUD standard that has always been present in the ESG program, and it has been little or never used in the Emergency Shelter Grants Program, and HUD does not expect it to be used in the future under the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. Next slide. The interim rule describes a maintenance of effort provision for street outreach and emergency shelter for recipients and subrecipients who are units of general purpose local government. In short, metropolitan cities and urban counties who are a recipient of an ESG allocation from HUD and units of general purpose local governments who receive funds directly from a state's ESG allocation cannot use their ESG funds to replace funds that the local government provided for street outreach and emergency shelter services during the immediately preceding 12-month period unless HUD determines the local government is in severe financial distress. Next slide. Under the minimum period of use provisions, street outreach-related services must be provided for the full duration of the recipient's commitment of ESG funding for street outreach. Likewise, where ESG funds are used solely for essential services or shelter operations, services or shelter must be provided to the homeless individuals and families for the full duration of the recipient's commitment of ESG funding. Next slide. Expenditure limits. The interim regulations again establish a cap on emergency shelter and street outreach costs. The amount of funds that may be used for an emergency shelter or street outreach cannot exceed 60% of the recipient's fiscal year grant or the amount of the fiscal year 2010 grant funds designated for street outreach and emergency shelter activities in the recipient's approved consolidated plan. That completes my presentation on the shelter component, and now we're going to turn this over for a poll quiz.
That's great, Mike. Thanks very much. So yes, we do like to ask several poll questions throughout the webinars to help give us a sense of how we're doing. The first poll question is on your screen. This presentation in particular has a lot of content, so I want to move through these polls relatively quickly. So the first one is services that are routinely provided in a sheltered setting to unsheltered persons can be billed as street outreach. And you can click true or false. And I'll wait just a few seconds for folks to get their votes in. We've got about half of you who have voted. Okay. So let's see. So the majority of you have voted, and it's split. We've got about 45% who have registered true, 55% who have registered false. So it looks like we have some work to do there. The correct response is false. So services that are routinely provided in a sheltered setting are not eligible street outreach activities. And we can cover this a little bit more later on in the presentation. Now I'd like to turn it back to Irene.
Thanks, Mark. The third and fourth components of the Emergency Solutions Grants Program are homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, respectively. These components reflect key changes in the Emergency Solutions Grants Program with the expansion of the homelessness prevention component and the addition of a new rapid rehousing component. First, let's review some overarching principles that are going to highlight some similarities and distinctions between the two components. As you can see, homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing target and serve two very distinct populations. Rapid rehousing serving those who are currently literally homeless, and homelessness prevention serving those at risk of homelessness who also have an income at or below 30% AMI, area median income. The eligible activities under each component are the same: shelter, short and medium-term rental assistance, and housing relocation and stabilization services. Since the activities for both components are the same, it is the participant eligibility conditions that truly distinguish them. In addition, because the activities are the same, we have combined the discussion of these components in this portion of the webinar. Next slide, please. The purpose of the homelessness prevention component is to prevent persons at risk of being homeless from moving into an emergency shelter or place not meant for human habitation, with the goal of helping them regain stability in their current housing or in other permanent housing. The eligible activities under homelessness prevention, as we mentioned previously, are housing relocation and stabilization services and short and medium-term rental assistance. Next slide, please. By contrast, the purpose of the rapid rehousing component is to help already homeless persons living in emergency shelter or on the streets to transition as quickly as possible into permanent housing to then achieve stability in that housing. We'd like to note that literally homeless includes persons exiting an institution where they've resided for 90 days or less, who also resided in an emergency shelter or place not meant for human habitation immediately prior to entering that institution. Eligibility for rapid rehousing assistance is very similar to eligibility for HPRP, with the primary differences being the income eligibility requirement. Under HPRP, access to all assistance was dependent upon meeting 50% AMI. Under ESG rapid rehousing, eligibility for initial placement and stabilization assistance is not at all dependent upon household income, but eligibility for continued assistance is dependent on 30% AMI. And we'll go into that information in a little bit more detail in the user guides and later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. As we have mentioned, both the homeless prevention and rapid rehousing components involve the same eligible activities: housing relocation and stabilization services, and short and medium-term rental assistance. This slide and the next few slides will provide overviews of the eligible costs of those activities. We'll first review the assistance provided under housing relocation and stabilization services, which provides 6 types of financial assistance and 5 types of services as listed on the slide. The eligible costs and requirements for providing housing relocation and stabilization services are based on HUD's experience in developing and administering HPRP, so many of the facets of assistance may look familiar to those of you who participated in the HPRP implementation. As you may have already noted, an important distinction from HPRP, rental assistance is not listed as financial assistance, as it has been broken off and is its own eligible activity, which will be discussed later in this presentation. Next slide, please. 6 eligible costs are detailed as financial assistance under housing relocation and stabilization services. Eligible financial assistance includes rental application fees that are charged by the owner to all applicants, security deposit equal to no more than 2 months' rent, last month's rent paid to the owner of housing at the time security deposit and first month's rent are paid. Moving costs such as truck rental, hiring a moving company, and certain temporary storage fees. Standard utility deposits required by the utility company for all customers. And the eligible utility services are gas, electric, water, or sewage. And up to 24 months of utility payments per participant per service, including up to 6 months of arrearages per service. And again, those eligible services are gas, electric, water, or sewage. I'd like to note a difference again from HPRP, which provided utility assistance for up to 18 months. And as we've noted, the ESG program has increased that time frame to 24 months. These various forms of financial assistance may be paid to housing owners, to housing owners, utility companies, and other third parties, but may not be paid directly to participant households. Next slide, please. 5 types of services are detailed under housing relocation and stabilization services. The first type of eligible service cost is housing search and placement. This service includes activities necessary to assist program participants in locating, obtaining, and retaining suitable permanent housing. Activities include assessment of barriers, assessment of housing compliance, and tenant counseling. Next slide, please. The second type of eligible service cost is housing stability case management, which is the keystone of homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing activities. Pursuant to the provisions of the interim rule, every individual or family receiving homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing assistance is required to meet with a stabilization case manager at least once a month. Every package of assistance must include the provision of such case management assistance. The service includes assessing, arranging, coordinating, and monitoring the delivery of individualized services to facilitate housing stability. An extensive list of activities is detailed on this slide, including the development of an individualized housing and service plan. Next slide, please. The third type of eligible service is mediation between the program participant or renter and the housing owner. Mediation services are only eligible when necessary to prevent a program participant from losing permanent housing. Next slide, please. The fourth type of eligible service is legal services. Eligible legal services outlined under the homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing components are similar to those outlined under the emergency shelter component, but are expanded to include landlord-tenant matters. Legal services are only eligible under this service when they are necessary to resolve a legal problem that prohibits the program participant from obtaining or maintaining permanent housing. Again, ESG funds may only be used for those services to the extent that other appropriate legal services are unavailable or inaccessible within the community. Next slide, please. As noted on the previous slide, legal services under Housing Relocation Stabilization Services have been expanded to include landlord-tenant matters necessary to resolve a legal problem that prevents a participant from obtaining or maintaining permanent housing. Next slide, please. The fifth and final type of eligible service cost is credit repair. Credit repair services include credit counseling and development of critical budgeting and money management skills. And please note that assistance cannot include the payment or modification of a debt. Next slide, please. The interim rule establishes several requirements related to housing relocation and stabilization. Most prominent, as we discussed earlier, is the requirement that participants must meet with a stabilization case manager at least once a month for the duration of assistance. An exception is made for clients of victim services providers, and details can be found in the forthcoming user guide. Additional requirements include that each program participant must be assisted as needed to obtain appropriate supportive services, including assistance with obtaining permanent housing, medical health treatment, mental health treatment, counseling, supervision, and other services essential for achieving independent living, and other mainstream federal, state, local, and private assistance available to assist that program participant in obtaining housing stability, including Medicaid, SSI, or TANF. Comprehensive lists of the appropriate services and mainstream benefits can also be found in the user guide. And now I'll hand it over to Janet, who will discuss short and medium-term rental assistance.
So Irene has covered housing, relocation, and stabilization services. I'm going to tell you about the second eligible activity under the homeless prevention and rapid rehousing components, and that is short and medium-term rental assistance. There are three basic kinds of rental assistance. Short-term lasts for up to 3 months. Medium-term is 4 to 24 months. And you can also do payment of rental arrears, a one-time payment for up to 6 months of back rent, including any late fees. You can also do any combination of the three types of rental assistance, short-term, medium-term, or rental arrears, as long as the total doesn't exceed 24 months during any 3-year period. Next slide, please. Rental assistance comes in two forms, tenant-based and project-based. The main distinction is whether the participants get to select their own units, as they do under tenant-based assistance, or whether the recipient or subrecipient subsidizes particular units that are made available to participants, as they do under project-based rental assistance. Next slide. There are quite a few requirements that are associated with rental assistance. So you'll need to review the regulations and the user guides very carefully to get all of the details. I'm going to highlight just some of the ideas that you'll want to be sure that you pay particular attention to. The first is that rent needs to fall within the fair market limits, and you also need to meet the rent reasonableness requirements. Second, the housing has to meet minimum habitability standards. For those of you who are familiar with HQS, or Housing Quality Standards, note that these are not the same thing as the habitability standards. There are particular requirements for habitability standards for this rental assistance. Also note that there must be a rental assistance agreement and an acceptable lease in place. Next slide. In addition, rental assistance cannot be used with other subsidies. If a household is getting other housing subsidies like public housing, housing choice vouchers, project-based assistance, or Uniform Relocation Act assistance, you cannot provide ESG funds to help with rent for the same time period. You can help someone who's received those kinds of assistance in the past. You just can't do it concurrently. On the other hand, you can provide up to 6 months of assistance to cover rental arrears, even if the participant was receiving other rental assistance during those months when they were getting behind. Next slide, please. Finally, rental assistance agreements should mirror the participant's lease. That means that in terms of things like the late payment requirements in the lease, the due date, the grace period, and the late payment penalties. Recipients and subrecipients are expected to make their payments on time. So if a recipient or subrecipient incurs any late fees because of late subsidy payments, they have to pay those late fees with non-ESG funds. Next slide, please. Finally, there is a maximum period of use for assistance. And I want to note that this applies to both housing relocation and stabilization services, like Irene talked about, and the short and medium-term rental assistance. The basic rule is that a program participant is not permitted to receive services for more than 24 months during any 3-year period. There is one exception for people living on the street or in emergency shelter who are searching for permanent housing. These participants can receive 30 days of case management that can be charged to the rapid rehousing activity. Working with clients as part of a rapid rehousing activity means that case management assistance can be provided to people in emergency shelters and on the street without being subject to the street outreach and essential services cap. Finally, recipients have some discretion to set additional limits. In particular, they can set maximum dollar amounts and maximum periods of assistance as long as those requirements are within the limits set by the regulation. So, Mark, I think we are ready for another poll.
Thank you, Janet. That was excellent. Okay, so we have our next two poll questions, and they are on your screen. The first one, true or false? Both homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing provide for rental assistance and relocation stabilization. So go ahead and vote on that first one. True or false? We've got about half of you who have voted. All right, that's great. So let's cut it off there. And you are correct. 81% of you said true. Rental assistance and housing relocation and stability activities are eligible activities under both the homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing components. The difference between the two components is whether they serve clients who are literally homeless or at risk of homelessness. So back to the second poll question, if we can. Which persons are potentially eligible for rapid rehousing assistance subject to local priorities and available funding? And you have a choice of 3. Okay. Votes are coming in a little slower on this one. We've got about half of you in now. I think that's probably good. We can cut that off there. So correct, about 81% again got the correct answer, which was A. Those who are literally homeless receive rapid rehousing assistance, while those who are at imminent risk or at risk of homelessness may receive homelessness prevention assistance. So great. And I'm going to turn it over to Brett to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. The final component for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program is HMIS, or the Homeless Management Information System. Next slide, please. All recipients and subrecipients are required to collect data. Most of them will use the HMIS. The only exception to the use of HMIS is for victim service providers who must use a comparable database, and legal service providers who may use a comparable database if they feel that it will protect attorney-client privilege. ESG funds may be used for these costs. Where the recipient is also an HMIS lead, there are also additional costs that ESG funds may support. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, while participation in HMIS has always been strongly encouraged and many ESG providers are already participating, The McKinney-Vento Act, as amended by the Hearth Act, makes HMIS participation a statutory requirement for recipients of ESG funds. For those participants using a comparable database, the comparable database must meet the standards of an HMIS. Next slide, please. Over the next few slides, we're going to begin reviewing the costs that are eligible with ESG funds. The costs that are listed on these slides are eligible to all recipients and subrecipients except for states to support data intake and contributing to an HMIS. Next slide, please. The costs listed on this slide are more costs that are associated with contributing and participating in an HMIS. These costs are eligible for recipients and subrecipients except for states. States may subgrant funds out to support these costs. Next slide, please. The costs on these slides are related to hosting the HMIS, backing up data, customizing the HMIS, and other system-wide activities. These costs are only allowable at this point for recipients that are designated the HMIS lead agency by the COC. As Mike mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, if the state is the HMIS lead, it may retain funds for these costs. Next slide, please. For those recipients and subrecipients that are victim service providers or legal service providers using a comparable database, the costs of establishing and operating the comparable database are eligible with ESG funds. Information entered into a comparable database must not be entered directly into or provided to an HMIS at any time. Next slide, please. All activities funded under this component must comply with currently published standards. HMISs and comparable database will be expected to comply with the HMIS final rule when it's published. And now I'm going to turn it over to Janet, who's going to review the related administrative activities under the ESG program.
Okay. Administrative activities. We've talked already about 5 different components. Administrative activities are not one of the 5 components, but they can be funded from the ESG grant. Next slide, please. So the basic rule is that up to 7.5% of a recipient's ESG grant can be used for administrative costs related to planning and executing ESG activities. But here's the important caveat. The cap does not include staff and overhead costs that are directly related to carrying out activities under one of those 5 ESG components. Costs directly related to carrying out street outreach, emergency shelter, homeless prevention, rapid rehousing can be paid for as part of those activities and are not subject to the 7.5% cap. Next slide, please. So with that 7.5%, there are 4 categories of eligible administrative costs. General management, oversight, and coordination, training on ESG requirements, consolidated plan work, and environmental review activities. Next slide, please. Let's look first at the general oversight, management, and coordination. Most of the administrative activities that you are likely to pay for with the 7.5% are likely to involve the cost of overall program management, coordination, monitoring, and evaluation. That's going to include things like costs of travel for monitoring, the cost of third-party contractors like legal or accounting or audit services, other goods and services that you need to administer the program, like renting office space or acquiring office equipment and supplies, and things like staff salaries. Next slide, please. Other eligible costs will include training on ESG requirements, and that would include attending HUD-sponsored ESG trainings, preparing and amending the ESG and homelessness-related sections of the consolidated plan, and carrying out those environmental review responsibilities. Next slide, please. Finally, recipients may need to share some of that 7.5% with others. The rules for sharing you saw in that initial slide that Mike presented at the beginning. The gist is that the sharing is going to vary depending on the type of recipient and the type of subrecipient. So if the recipient is a state, they have to share if they're working with a subrecipient that is a unit of general purpose local government. They can choose whether to share if they're working with a nonprofit. For recipients who are territories, metropolitan cities, or urban counties, the recipient always gets to choose whether they want to share their administrative costs with their subrecipients. So the only recipients that are required to share are states when they're working with local governments. And that's it for administrative activities. Mark, have you got another poll for us?
All right. Thanks again, Janet. We have about 10 minutes to go. We're right on time. And we do have our final 2 polls, which are on your screen now. The first one, true or false, the HMIS component can fund HMIS participation fees. So please go ahead and register your vote. Okay, you guys are good. So over 80% of you were correct. The answer is true. Participation fees as well as staff costs, equipment, software, and training are all eligible costs. So that's excellent. Now let's go to the second and final poll question here. State ESG recipients must share funding for administrative costs with nonprofit subrecipients. True or false? All right, excellent. You guys are paying attention. So the correct answer is false. State recipients must share their administrative costs with units of general purpose local government, but may choose to share with nonprofits. So I'm going to go to the final presentation piece to Irene.
Thanks, Mark. Finally, ESG funds may be used to pay indirect costs in accordance with the applicable OMB circulars as cited on your slide. Indirect costs may be applied to each eligible activity using the direct cost base specified in the approved cost allocation plan. Indirect costs are not considered an administrative activity, but rather cover any costs that are not readily identifiable with a particular cost objective. A good example is often the executive director's salary or finance department in a nonprofit organization. Let's take an example even further. When applicable, indirect costs can be allocated to street outreach activities performed under ESG. This means a recipient or subrecipient would have a way to cover some of the indirect costs assumed by the organization as a result of performing street outreach. These indirect costs would be identified as part of the street outreach allocation. So note in this example, street outreach is subject to an expenditure limit. When allocating indirect costs to an activity with an expenditure limit, the indirect costs must be added to the direct costs, and the total costs are then compared to the expenditure limit to ensure compliance. And I think it's back to you, Mark.
Okay, I'll wrap it up. So thanks very much to Mike, Brett, Janet, and Irene for the presentation, and to Fred and Susan for their help answering people's questions today. Thank you all very much for joining us. There are a number of other upcoming webinars that are scheduled that we hope you'll join us for. Next slide, please. Also, please keep an eye out for a number of user guides that are being prepared to assist you in your work. Next slide. As always, be sure to visit HUD's Homelessness Resource Exchange website for a wealth of helpful materials and resources. As a reminder, if you have questions that we didn't get to today, please submit them to the virtual help desk. And the next and last slide. So this presentation today has covered ESG's eligible costs and the activities that can be undertaken by component. Together with the links to other useful resources that were highlighted, we hope you have a better understanding of this topic and that you are now ready to proceed with your preparation for implementation of ESG programs. Thanks again for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.